Hello, and welcome to the third episode of the Centerville, Iowa Memories podcast. I'm Lucas, and this is my co-host Lisa.
Hello.
And today we'll be covering the topic of crimes of Appanoose County. But before we dive into that subject, I would like Lisa to give us a small recap on last month's topic of the levy, as it will tie into this month's topic.
Yes, it does tie into last month's topic. As we talked about last month, the levy back in the early 1900s and before, it was not what we know the levy as today. It was a lawless area. There was a lot of drinking, a lot of fighting, a great deal of immigrants, and so there were tensions, and it was kind of a scary place to be. And so that kind of sets the stage for us to explain some of the crimes that were committed in Centerville. Not all of the crimes happened in South Centerville. The lion's share were in that area. And before we get too far, I'd like to shout out some thanks to Gary Craver for all of his research that he's provided to us, and also to Enfys McMurray for her research and her book, Centerville, A Mid-American Saga, where a lot of these stories you can find in written form. So to start off, I'm going to hand it back over to Luke, and he's going to tell us about the area in Centerville that got an infamous name of the Death Spot.
Yes, there was a location in Centerville that did become known as the Death Spot. And it got its name from a 1921 article by the Des Moines Register titled "Iowa Death Spot Claims 21 Victims." And that article was factual. There was 21 deaths over a 15-year span from 1906 to 1921. And the death spot was located in a block radius around 18th Street and Cottage, where for anyone who lives here or knows the area, that would be where Convenience Corner sits today. This intersection is also where the Rock Island Railroad crossing was. So I'm going to kind of summarize the deaths that happened in that area between 1906 and 1921. To start with, there were 8 murders that the newspaper claims were over young girls. Then there were 3 deaths from shootings or duels. There was one unidentified man who was found dead by the railroad tracks with a pickaxe through his back, and they claimed this to be a robbery, as to his pockets were turned out and he had nothing on him at the time, and no suspect was ever found for this event. There was also 2 friends who shot and killed each other in a duel over a game of cards. There was also 4 fatalities due to drunken bar fights. 1 unknown man was found with his throat cut, to which no suspect was found for this as well. There was also 1 death by shooting over a disagreement of credit at an ice cream stall. And finally, an event called the Carmilla Russo Affair, where a young girl chased and shot down a man 7 times. The area became known to locals as a bad area, and the newspaper claims that newspaper boys would go blocks out of their way just to avoid the area, and that even telephone operators would hesitate to place calls to the area. Now we are going to focus on a few of the murders that happened in the area. I'm going to pass it now over to Lisa, and she is going to tell us a little bit about the Carmilla Russo Affair.
Carmilla Russo was an attractive 18-year-old woman that was living at home with her parents. I think it was 1607 South 18th Street. And back in that time frame, a lot of the immigrants in that area would take in boarders to help supplement their income. Plus, there were a lot of people that would want to have a place to live but hadn't brought their family over from their original country yet. And so there were a lot of places that served as boarding houses. The Russo family took in boarders. And one former boarder who had been at the Russo home was Tony Mato. He was an Italian immigrant who was working at the 30 mine. And he had been there for a while, but had since moved on and was then boarding now at the Luciano Tobia's home. And then on June 20th, 1920, he was walking north towards Centerville, and stopped when he saw Carmela Russo on the porch of her parents' house. He approached her, took her arm, and he had been known since he lived with them previously to making unwanted advances toward Carmela. And that night she'd had enough, and she shot him once in front of the house, and then she chased him down the alley and shot him 6 or 7 more times. Apparently this Tony Mato had been making trouble for Carmela for 3 years. He made unwanted advances. He wrote to her fiance, Cosimo Malone, telling that Carmela had been unfaithful to Cosimo. Whether this is true or not, we don't know. But her fiance broke up with her, and Carmela, of course, was upset. And Tony had just caused her nothing but trouble. So she went after him, she shot him, and then she called the police and turned herself in. But Carmela was very well liked in the community, and the community was very sympathetic to her story. She was found guilty of manslaughter and taken to the women's facility in Rockwell City. Another of the crimes in the death spot was a duel. And Luke, can you tell us more about that?
Yes, in October of 1913, there was a duel between 2 Italian immigrants who claimed to have been friends at one point and have been immigrated from southern Italy. Frank Rusci and Tony Bartello were the 2 men involved. And both of these men worked together in a mine and were a part of the same union. The newspaper states that Tony Bartello left his home around 3 p.m. that day, and that trouble did not arise till around 9 o'clock that evening, where Tony Bartello and Frank Rusci got into a heated argument over unknown circumstances. Tony Bartello left the card game to go retrieve his revolver, and Frank Rusci returned to the boarding house that he was staying at and got his firearm as well. The 2 then met at the Rock Island rail crossing around midnight. There was not any witnesses known to the duel, but it was known that Frank Rusci returned to the boarding house with 2 gunshot wounds. One was a minor flesh wound, and the other had gone into his abdomen. Rusci was then taken to the hospital where he died later on the next day. And Tony Bartello was found by the tracks with a single gunshot wound to his head where it said he died minutes after the duel. And this is just one example of murder that happened in South Centerville around this time. And there was another murder that was done by an organization in 1920, and that group is called the Black Hand. Lisa, could you tell us a little bit about the Black Hand?
The Black Hand was an extortion racket run by Italian gangsters in Italian communities in the big cities, New York, Kansas City, New Orleans, Chicago. And what they would do was send threatening notes to members of their own culture, other Italians who had done well and they knew had some money, and they would make these threatening notes. They would threaten death or kidnapping or arson or all sorts of different things if a certain amount of money wasn't placed at a location that they could pick it up. In Centerville, it showed up for the first time in 1911. The letters oftentimes would have depictions of threatening symbols like a smoking gun, hangman's noose, a knife dripping with blood, and oftentimes had a cold blackened handprint on the victim's door. There were many people in Centerville who had been threatened by the Black Hand. The Black Hand continued for a while. I think it started back in the 1700s, but it was mainly popular from 1890 to about 1920. And then when Prohibition was instituted, and it was replaced kind of by mafia and big money bootlegging operations, and the Black Hand sort of fell into decline. But one Black Hand murder in Centerville was Niccolo Vinceri. Luke, can you tell us a little bit more about that one?
In February of 1920, a man named Niccolo Vinceri a Italian business owner and mine worker, was shot and killed in an ambush style by what is presumed to be the Black Hand. At 5 a.m., Venturi awoke and exited his home to go feed his animals. As he exited, someone shot from the shadows, hitting Venturi just below his right arm. Venturi then ran around the side of his building and up onto the porch, where he then collapsed. Passerbys who heard the commotion ran to Venturi's aid, and as they were giving aid to Venturi, the shooter fled the scene and was never to be caught. Venturi's wife would then tell authorities that they had been receiving letters from the Black Hand organization. They had moved to Centerville 7 years prior, trying to escape letters from the Black Hand in their home in Illinois. Venturi's wife also claims that they were planning on moving from Centerville due to receiving more Black Hand letters. There were also other attempts to outsmart the Black Hand. One example would be another South Centerville resident, August Francisco, who received his own Black Hand letter demanding $150 or his life. The letter demanded he leave $150 in front of a White House, stating, "You know which one." August then placed the money where the letter demanded him to, and him and his son waited in the shadows, ready to ambush and kill anyone who arrived to receive the money. However, no one came to take the money that night. There are also many other examples of Centerville residents being threatened by the Black Hand organization. Lisa, could you tell us another example?
Yeah, I'll tell you the story about Tony DeZorzi. He was a South Side shopkeeper, but he lived at the corner of 10th and Van Buren, kind of close to where the post office is today. And in October of 1918, his house was blown up by dynamite. His family was able to escape unharmed, though. He was able to show the police the 3 Black Hand letters he had received that were threatening his life. They had trademark drawings of death. The drawing on the last one that he had received had a picture of himself in a casket with a stiletto knife in his heart. And the letter demanded $16,000, which in today's amount of money, that would be just over $240,000. So that was quite a demand. They were able to bring in bloodhounds to trace the tracks that were around his home back to the home of Frank Dana, who was already under suspicion over the murder of another man, Pearl Traxler. Also, Sam Falzone was arrested in this connection with this explosion. And the crazy thing is that these men, Frank Dana and Sam Falzone, were friends with Tony DeZorzi. But at the trial, they deemed the letters to be inadmissible since Dana couldn't read or write. So they just dismissed the Black Hand letters in this case. And the 2 men, Frank Dana and Sam Falzone, were acquitted. One of the most sensational murders that happened in Centerville happened in 1929. George Damjanich was a coal miner, 44 years old, and quite paranoid. He worked at the Empire Coal Mine, and he had retained lawyer D. Fulton Rice to represent him in a slander case in 1928 against another coal miner, Tony Carlotto, who had been calling him dirty and filthy, and there was a whole backstory to that, and he was angry about it, and so he had hired D. Fulton Rice, and the case had been in Rice's possession for about a year, and Damjanich, who couldn't speak English well, was frustrated. It was taking so long, and he didn't really understand when Rice would explain why, and he would visit Rice's office sometimes twice a day to keep checking on this. And so on February 28, 1929, Damjanich was waiting for D. Fulton Rice to leave the courthouse and going back to his office, which was above where the city bookstore was at the time. I think Bonnie's Needful Things is now. And as D. Fulton Rice left the courthouse, he approached him on the south walk of the courthouse lawn, and he tried to speak with D. Fulton Rice, and D. Fulton Rice was speaking to him but kept walking. And as he passed George Damjanich and was walking away from him to the south, George shot him twice in the back. He then walked back to the courthouse, handed his gun to Sheriff Goffenbaugh, and said, "He no handle my case right." He was eventually put on trial, but he pled guilty and was taken to the penitentiary in Fort Madison. And later that year, in September of that year, he committed suicide in prison.
And another noteworthy crime would be in October of 1921 when police officer H.A. Edwards, or Slim, offered some assistance to 3 individuals trying to work on a Ford car on the side of the road. In response to offering his help, the 3 men opened fire on Edwards, shooting him in his left leg, left wrist, and hitting him in the chest just right above his heart. As Edward lay on the ground, he fired shots back at the 3 men as they were trying to push the car down the road. Edwards miraculously survived the shooting due to the otherwise fatal shot in his chest hitting his metal police badge, saving his life.
All right, now I'm going to tell you about a death that happened a little bit later than these have been. This one in 1937. Paul McCarty and his 18-year-old wife Betty McCarty had taken off at 10 p.m. with their 2 friends, actually Betty's aunt. These friends were wanting them to drive with them to Unionville, Missouri, to wake up a justice of the peace and get married. They're 4 wide in the cab of the vehicle and drinking in excess. The couple is married. They come back to Centerville, all still drinking, and Paul McCarty and his wife had begun to argue. They stopped at the west end of Washington Street to get out, and the newlywed couple was trying to defuse the situation. They get in the car with Betty and take off, leaving Paul McCarty standing in the street. Betty is convincing them that they need to go back and get him. And as they get back, he is even madder, no doubt. And the other couple then gets out of the car, and they're all trying to defuse the situation again. And at this point, Paul and Betty get back in the vehicle and take off. And the last thing that the other couple heard Paul say to Betty is, "I'm going to take you home and kill you." And they drove west on Highway 2, leaving their friends behind. They did not turn on the Mystic Highway to go north as they should have, to go to Walnut City where they lived. And a little bit later, a call comes in to the police department, and the police respond to a call that there's a woman's body on the side of the road, her head run over, and Paul McCarty is sitting on the running boards crying. He tells the sheriff that the girl was leaning against the door and it came open. She fell out and he ran over her head. He actually tells them it's an entirely different person than who it is, which throws a wrench in things. The face is unrecognizable to the police, so the sheriff dispatches someone to tell the girl's parents the bad news. By this time, though, a group of nearby farmers and passers-by are gathering at this accident scene, but one of the people is Paul McCarty's dad. And his father, after hearing this story, says, "That's your Betty." He recognized her. And so the sheriff then had to put the brakes on telling the other family that their daughter was killed and trying to figure out what really happened. So there is blood inside the cab of the pickup, which shouldn't be the case if she had fallen out of the pickup and then been run over. There shouldn't have been blood in the cab. And of course the road, just west a little bit of Sunshine is where this occurred. And the town is kind of split on who they believe. A lot of them believe that Paul McCarty is telling the truth, while there are others that think he killed her, then pushed her body out and ran over her to cover his tracks. And so if we fast forward to the trial, the courtroom was packed every day. It was a very sensational time. And Paul McCarty was actually acquitted because his lawyer was able to establish the reasonable doubt. And so Luke is going to tell us about one more crime that happened even a little bit later in 1951.
Yes, so in April of 1951, there was a couple named Harry and Eloise Scarlett. They had recently divorced, to which Eloise did not want the divorce. Harry had left her and had gotten full custody of their children. And they still communicated, and Eloise tried to kind of repair their relationship, to which Harry didn't really want anything to do with. Now, Harry and Eloise had two children at the time, Doris, age 8, and Harry, age 11. Harry did ask Eloise to watch the children on and off, to which she generally obliged. And one night she agreed to watch the children while he went to work at the boiler room at the Iowa Southern Utilities plant. And as he left at 3 p.m., it is unknown what time, but Eloise broke into a locked closet in his home and took a .32 caliber revolver out of the closet. And it's unknown what time these events took place, but when Harry had returned home from his day at work at around midnight, he came into his house and found that his daughter Doris was dead in their living room. And he immediately called police at this point, and when police arrived, they were unable to tell whether Doris had been shot or how her death occurred. And it was later found out that she had beaten to death with a hammer. And in the next room, they found his son Harry had been shot in the head with a .32 caliber revolver. And Eloise laid on his bed with multiple cuts on her wrist and on her throat. Eloise was actually taken to the hospital where she survived her injuries, and later on was charged with the crimes of killing her two children. And she had admitted to beating her daughter to death with a hammer and shooting her son in the head with a .32 caliber revolver. She left notes saying that the crime could have been prevented, but blamed Harry for not wanting to repair their relationship.
Wow, that is such a sad story. Well, this has been quite a sampling of the crimes in Appanoose County, but it doesn't even hardly touch the surface of how many different things. There were robberies, and there's just been so many crimes that we have decided we'll probably revisit this subject down the road again to tell some more stories. But to finish off our podcast today, we're going to go to a little bit of a tangent from crime to a couple of the other interesting facts that we can attach to Appanoose County. The inventor of the Tommy gun is from Appanoose County. His name was Oscar Payne, and he worked for General Thompson, and he could have had the gun named after himself, but he did not feel that was appropriate, that his employer should take the name, and so it became the Thompson submachine gun, or better known as the Tommy gun. That is one of the displays that is most visited here in the museum, is the profile of Oscar V. Payne. And then using the Tommy gun, there's another connection for Centerville to the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. One of the people that is suspected of being one of the main shooters in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was Fred Burke, who had a lot of different aliases. He visited Centerville, and he got married here in Centerville to a local girl named Bonnie Porter. He, at that time, was known as Richard White, which was one of his aliases. After being married here in Centerville, they moved to northern Missouri, and eventually he was recognized and he was captured by authorities.
And that's going to kind of wrap it up for this month's episode. So be looking forward to next month's episode where we interview Enfys McMurray about the crash of Continental Flight 11 in 1962.